Kyle McNulty, and you're listening to Secure Ventures, the show that follows cutting-edge founders in the cybersecurity space to understand their plights, glories, and revolutionary products. With me in this episode is Kabir Mathur. Kabir is co-founder and CEO of Leen, which is creating a unified security API to enable simpler integrations of security tooling. As Kabir will immediately tell you, he has no background in cybersecurity. However, he does have extensive experience with growing partnerships and sales numbers in industries where he has no background. He worked in business development for the last 15 years across a variety of tech companies, including NativeX, Kiip, and Typeform. As he tells in the episode, he very carefully and patiently assembled the founding team, and the problem Leen is addressing then emerged as the imperative from their extensive whiteboarding sessions. Now, after a hot start, the team is in the middle of key strategy decisions that will determine the future of the company. This episode is brought to you by VulnCheck. VulnCheck helps teams defend against weaponized exploits by delivering the most comprehensive vulnerability and exploit intelligence in the market today. VulnCheck gives enterprise and federal teams better, faster data so they can autonomously prevent exploits and reduce risk and outpace adversaries. So what's different about VulnCheck? The company delivers its solutions to teams in machine-readable and consumable formats for a truly autonomous approach to vulnerability prioritization and exploit mitigation. VulnCheck has close to 300 million unique data points, which is 5 times the exploits of ExploitDB, and 200 plus CVEs packaged into complete detection artifacts for proactive teams. VulnCheck provides a full suite of solutions to enable teams with rapid adoption of VulnCheck data, including its community tier of offerings and its enterprise-class solutions, exploit and vulnerability intelligence, and initial access intelligence. With VulnCheck, teams can proactively defend against remote execution events, enrich every data source, and continuously outpace adversaries. If you're interested in learning more about VulnCheck and checking out the free community edition where you can play with their database of known exploited vulnerabilities, please click the link in the show description so they know you came from the podcast. Kabir, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Kyle.
Now, one of the interesting pieces about your background is you don't come from a kind of traditional cybersecurity focus. You've worked in a combination of business development and account management for the better part of the last, let's say, 15 or so years across a variety of different tech companies at different stages as well, but mostly on the earlier side. So, walk me through what that transition looked like, thinking about some of the kind of important lessons that you learned earlier in your career based on that more account and BD focused angle. And then we'll start to connect that back to the transition to Leen and your role today.
Yeah, so it's been definitely an interesting journey. It's interesting to be in security and be on podcasts like this one, where obviously your listeners are probably way more experienced than I am within security. But the way I look at this is, I've worked at startups my entire career, 15 or so years now. I've spent time in gaming, then I went to ad tech, then I went to B2B SaaS. I actually enjoy the challenge of switching industries every 5-7 years because I love learning, right? There's commonalities across all of these different industries. There's lessons you can bring with you, but then especially for someone that does business development and partnerships and works across multiple groups within an organization, you enjoy the challenge of understanding where the leverage points are within a certain industry. So that's how I approach industries. I try to understand, okay, who are the players? What are the dynamics between these players? How are decisions made? And then that's the superpower, so to speak, that I think I can bring to a new industry. I have 2 co-founders. I'm the co-founder and CEO at Leen. I have 2 co-founders, Neil and Akash. And Neil is the one that actually brings the security experience to our team. So when he started talking to us about this idea, it got me really excited because I've personally worked with integrations in different industries like the ones I mentioned for the better part of the last decade. In ad tech, it's a very integration and partnership-driven industry. Same with B2B SaaS. I was at a company called Typeform where I was building partnerships with companies like Salesforce and HubSpot, and they're all technical partnerships, very predicated on working with the APIs. So when he laid out this whole vision to me and explained the problem within security, I naturally gravitated towards it because there's a part of my experience, of course, that I can bring to it, but there's a whole set of new learning that's happening every day on the job about security and the nuances of it. And it's really exciting, honestly, for me to be on this journey.
Yeah, we'll get more into the security transition in itself. But I'm curious, you mentioned, hey, I just wanted to kind of try new industries after 5 to 7 years, just something new, right? But were there any industries where after working in it for a handful of years, you're like, oh, I need to get out of this industry for like X, Y, or Z reasons?
Well, yeah, I feel that way about ad tech, and no offense to anyone listening to this that is still working in that industry or has ties to it. I think it's for many, many reasons. It's not the most exciting space for one, because it's very top heavy. It's dominated by the Facebooks and the Googles of the world, of course, as they take 90% of the pie, and then there's a few thousand companies fighting for the crumbs basically in the industry. So that dynamic makes it very difficult, and there's not a huge amount of innovation. And as someone that works in startups, you pour, even as an employee, right? Of course, now I'm a founder and it takes over your life, but even as an employee, you pour a good part of your soul into the company. And at the end of the day, you boil it down and your whole job is to make people click on ads, which beyond a certain point, it's really hard to motivate yourself to do that for decades. So those are my candid thoughts on that industry.
Yeah, it is funny when you distill any industry down to the core component, like in that example, making people click on ads, all of a sudden it starts to look a whole lot less sexy, right?
That's right.
Okay, so you had this experience across all these different industries. One of the things that stuck out to me on your LinkedIn profile, at least, was you actually had it listed that you spent almost a year and a half looking for startup ideas. So you'd kind of gone through this series of experiences on the account and BD side, and then this was, I think it was 2022, 2023 that you decided, hey, let's go ahead and start something. But again, you took your time to actually go and find what that idea was going to be, and you were doing that full time, to my understanding as well. What did that decision process look like for you to say, okay, I want to go and start something, but I also want to be very strategic and methodical about it?
Yeah, it was a really interesting journey, and I made a lot of mistakes that hopefully other people can learn from. So if anyone listening to this just wants to chat about that, there's so much knowledge to share. Feel free to reach out. To me, a couple of things happened, right? I was very determined to start my own company. It's something that I've wanted to do. It's the reason I've stayed within the startup space. Honestly, I could have gone to big tech and gotten that experience, but based on what I do, I felt like the best knowledge that I could gain was from being really close to the action, which was working at these really early stage companies. I saw some of them through to exit. So really it was almost a full life cycle of these startups. Some of them which went completely bust as well. So I really have seen quite a lot of that experience. And it just got to the point where I felt like I had the right knowledge and experience and resiliency to take on building my own thing. And then there were some catalysts with what was happening at my job at Typeform. There were reasons why I wasn't as excited about that role anymore. So I just used that as a catalyst to say, okay, now is as good as a time as any to jump in head first. And yeah, a lot of people, of course, do this with a team in place, with an idea in place. I didn't have either, but I had the conviction. So I went about this process of finding the team and exploring different areas. I explored Web3, I explored B2B SaaS because I knew that really well. I explored things around integrations and making the lives of PMs and marketing people easier, all sorts of different themes. And actually, even when we came together as a team, I identified the right team to work with. We started by working on a completely different idea. It wasn't in security. And when we failed at that learned and then failed for about 3 months, then we decided, okay, this is not working out. Let's go back to other ideas that we've been thinking about. And this is when Neil shared his frustrations at his previous job and how he thought this could be a big enough business, did the classic kind of validation process and everything, and learned that sure enough, this problem statement that we had, this hypothesis that we had seemed to be valid from those initial conversations we were having. And then we built the conviction to actually build a company around it.
So in that process, you kind of had this gap where you started kicking the tires on some of these different ideas. Were you just whiteboarding across all these different industries? What sort of problems existed out there? I mean, take me through just one level deeper in terms of how you arrived at that first idea. It sounds like Leen itself was kind of this brainchild of Neil to some extent, where he already had this vision in place and some conviction around it. But what did that first process look like?
Yeah, I think it's really about doing both primary and secondary research. So secondary research, you look at different industries where you have a personal interest. In my case, I shared a few of those, and just look at themes and the things that people are talking about, or some hypotheses that you might already have. And the nice thing about what I've done in the past is I'm not afraid to talk to people. I'm not afraid to reach out cold. And a lot of it comes down to that, right? You need to talk to decision makers. You need to test your hypotheses with them, see if there's anything there. And it's just a nice flywheel that you can create for yourself if you do end up finding a hypothesis that seems to have some type of traction, because those folks that you're talking to could actually become your early design partners and so on. And that's actually what ended up happening with Leen. We were doing validation calls, and now some of those folks that we initially talked to are our early customers. So I would say those are the two main pieces. Is you do a lot of reading and follow influencers in particular spaces, and then a lot of it is just reaching out to those same people and other folks in the industry to get a more granular level understanding of what it is that they do day to day, what are their core frustrations, and the other classic questions that you would want to ask during the validation process. If you do come up with some type of solution, what does it work to them? What does the buying process look like? All of that kind of stuff.
I've mentioned this a few times on this show before, but I think a lot of advice that founders give, you can find one example where it worked for someone and one example where it failed for someone else. And so there's a lot of context that exists there. But I think something that's been very universally true is the companies that find the early design partners as part of just the kind of problem discovery phase just have a astronomically, I won't say easier, but more straightforward progression into some of those early customers, and building the trust of some of these early partners that just give you important feedback as you keep moving forward. And so it sounds like there was certainly the understanding of that value from your team as well. Before we move on here, I just want to kind of iron in the timeline a little bit more, because you mentioned that you spent a few months working through that initial idea, but you had this kind of year and a half, again, listed without really anything tied to it. So how long into that year and a half was it that Neil got you guys together and said, hey, I think this is what we should go forward with, and then you decided, all right, time to gun it with Leen?
Yeah, so April 2022 is when I left my job at Typeform and decided to focus on this full time. I ended up meeting both Neil and Akash a little later that year. And there's a co-founder, I like to describe it as co-founder dating process, right? That happens. We knew each other, but we had never worked together. So it was about understanding, especially with 3 people on the team that had never worked together before. You want to test some projects together and ensure that we're actually bringing our strengths to the table and they're complementary, and we're accounting for the other people's weaknesses and so on. That whole exercise. We started to work together around December more formally, and we were working on this other idea at the time, which actually brought us together. And we did that for about 3.5 months. Didn't see the traction as I was explaining before. And that's when we went back to the drawing board. We literally drew a bunch of ideas on a whiteboard and a spreadsheet, and then we started ranking them based on different dimensions, growth opportunities, how much competition is in that space, founder market fit, which is probably the most important dimension, right? It's not just about looking at random ideas and saying, oh, we think we can solve this problem. Are we the right team to solve this problem? And when we ranked Neil's idea, that is now Leen, on that matrix, it actually was number 1. Because we felt we were the right team to solve this problem. We felt this was the right time to do it. And potentially there's a big enough opportunity, which we then later validated by talking to close to 100 folks in the industry. And there was enough resonance there that we gained conviction to go for it.
Yeah, and that was part of what I wanted to draw out in that timeline piece, was that you spent 8 months just kind of figuring out what you were going to do and building that initial team together. So just, I think, a great example of the kind of patience that turns out to be very valuable when thinking about starting a company, as opposed to kind of feeling the time pressure, leaving Typeform and just feeling like you immediately need to go into something? Because I'm sure you had friends and family and relatives, whatever it was, that were all kind of pressuring you like, okay, it's been 6 months and you're still just kind of whiteboarding. Like, what's going on? And so I think massive kudos to you for sticking through that and taking the kind of patient approach there. So you have this whiteboarding session. You say that it ranks number one in terms of founder market fit and a variety of other elements. But what was it from just the kind of overall landscape when you looked at this problem in terms of disparate cybersecurity tools, this data flowing all these different directions and all these different formats, custom APIs for every single tool? What was it that was really compelling to you that made you decide, hey, yeah, we should go after this?
Yeah, it was a few different things. So I would say at least 3 different types of signals that gave us the conviction. One was just understanding the landscape, right? And you look at it and there's 4,000 or so vendors, many of them are multi-products, so there's 10,000 plus products. And you draw analogies, right? It's very helpful in those early days, at least, to draw analogies to what's happened in similar spaces. Luckily, I had worked on a lot of integrations, and with regular B2B SaaS integrations, you have tools like Zapier, and then you have the classic type of iPaaS platforms like the Workado, as they used to be, MuleSoft, which now is owned by Salesforce, and a bunch of these. And the reason those companies exist is because there's thousands of tools within B2B SaaS that need, in theory, could be connected to one another to build custom and useful workflows. And we, in theory, at least, it seemed like that dynamic was true of security as well. But that's, of course, just a theoretical understanding. It helps, but it's not enough to gain conviction. The second, which I think is absolutely critical for folks to solve a problem if they're thinking about starting a company, is to have firsthand experience with it. So I, of course, have tangential experience with something similar, but the experience that Neil had at this company, Blue Voyant, where he was a senior principal engineer and he built out their whole data orchestration and automation layer, which involved building tons of different integrations within security, normalizing the data across them, correlating that data. So he had a very visceral understanding of this problem. And that was, of course, the core hypothesis, but then, you have to trust your gut a lot early on. And that was kind of the gut check that gave our team conviction. And the third is to make sure that it's not just a problem that you had. It's a problem that's potentially widespread enough to warrant building a business. And that's where we went out and reached out to all sorts of people in security. We talked to CISOs, we talked to heads of security engineering, we talked to ICs on security engineering teams, we talked to some analysts as well, and then we talked to a whole host of folks on the vendor side of the equation as well. So C-levels, engineering managers, product managers, to understand, hey, is this actually a problem that you face? How are you solving it today? All of that. And it was those 3 signals all put together that gave us the conviction.
Yeah. So if I try to describe this kind of problem and solution with a bit of a real world example here, you can go ahead and correct me and fill in the details, but just so everyone's kind of following along with what we're talking about. Had a past client in my consulting days with a big ServiceNow deployment, and they wanted to integrate in all these different security tools within their organization, but it would take a couple of weeks for each of these integrations, even if ServiceNow already had one kind of ready to go, because you have different API keys, different API formats. And so it becomes incredibly cumbersome to build out these API integrations between some of these different security tools. The idea behind Leen is you then have one kind of unified API, which sits in front of all the rest of your security tools. So developers then only have to basically query that Leen API, which will then do a lot of the normalization. So you can use the same kind of methods, the same formats, and then retrieve your outputs, your data from all your different security tools across your organization. Fair summary, what would you add?
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's how our customers use us today. So today, we're primarily serving other security vendors that need to build out integrations to the rest of the ecosystem. It's a huge product and engineering overhead task, like you described, right? It could take a couple of weeks. I think that's the best case scenario in a lot of cases. We've talked to teams where it takes them a month or more, because If you break down building an integration, generally we're talking about pretty seasoned engineers. So it's not dealing with the APIs that's necessarily a problem. In security, you actually have to gain access to those APIs first, because a lot of them are behind partnership walls, right? So you have to go sign a partnership agreement with, let's say, CrowdStrike, and then CrowdStrike gives you access to their APIs, and then you have to stand up some sandbox data to actually test those APIs. You need to understand the data structures. If you distill this problem down, the way I like to think about it is security teams think about their jobs in terms of the assets that they're trying to protect within their environment, right? And there are not 10,000 types of assets, but there are 10,000 products that have a perspective on those assets. And within enterprise security teams operating at scale, they often have 50, 75, sometimes even 100 different security tools that all have different perspectives on maybe a dozen types of assets. And by assets, I mean endpoints or containers or identities or mobile devices, whatever those may be that you're trying to protect. And this is where the complexity comes in, because each of these vendors, each of these products has a different way to describe that asset and a different perspective on it, which is expressed tactically as different API formats. And that's where Lean can potentially add a lot of value, because we take on that complexity. We build these connectors with dozens of different tools in the industry. We normalize that data. It's not possible, I want to call this out, to have a unified data schema across all of security data. I know there are some open source initiatives like OCSF, and we actually do that spec to some extent. But what we do instead is we break it down on a category by category basis. So for EDR, for example, it doesn't matter if the upstream vendor is CrowdStrike or SentinelOne, the data will look the same to our customers. We do the same thing for vulnerability management. We do the same thing for CSPM, AppSec, DLP, and email security, and all of these other categories, right? So that's kind of how we distill the problem down and how we solve it.
What is the core team within a cybersecurity organization that's using this capability today? So is it AppSec? Is it security operations? Is it vulnerability management?
Yeah, so a lot of our customers today, like I mentioned, are other security vendors. So there it's typically the engineering and the product teams that use it just to scale their integrations. But on the core security team side, what we've seen is that there's a lot of sort of cross-pollination of the types of products within a given environment that different teams care about, right? So someone responsible for cloud security actually cares about what's happening in their EDR tool and their VMS tool as well. So we've found good success with heads of security engineering, heads of cloud security, some AppSec folks as well, where they have a lot of tools in their stack that they need to wrangle data from. And that's the first problem that we're solving for them, is around visibility. Let's just give you access to all of this data in one place, and then let's see what you do with the data, right? So it's still the early days. This is why I'm being a little bit vague, because we are still a young company. We're in the very early stages of working with these security teams directly, but these are the personas where we've seen some early success.
But just to be clear and reiterate, I think you said that your kind of initial traction, you're actually seeing much more on the vendor side when they're trying to build out all these integrations. So it would be like, going back to my example, ServiceNow itself trying to kind of simplify the process of the end customer, then being able to just click a button and kind of bring in some of these different tools in the platform. Is that right?
That's exactly right. Yeah. So on the vendor side, they would, instead of building dozens of different integrations, they build one integration to Lean's API, and we handle all of that complexity for them. We handle the changes to the APIs because we sign partnership agreements with every one of these vendors. And in a lot of cases, we get a heads up if they're going to deprecate something in their API or make breaking changes or whatever that may be. And yeah, as much as possible, we obfuscate that complexity away from our customers so they can stay focused on their core roadmap, which is key for a lot of these companies that we're working with. They're early stage startups or even growth stage startups, typically, that are resource constrained.
From a business strategy standpoint, do you see yourselves continuing to focus on that security vendor market? Is that kind of big enough for the team, or is that just kind of the initial stepping stone to get into the larger kind of security ecosystem?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's one that we asked ourselves early on, because like I mentioned earlier, we did validation with all of these different segments, and we were trying to figure out, okay, what is the right segment to serve and at what point in time? Now, there's no manual for how to do startups. There's no right or wrong way. We had two options in front of us, right? We always knew we wanted to serve security teams. What we could have done is just built our product out for a year and a half, however long it takes, which is a very typical path that a lot of companies take it. Build out a bunch of connectors, make it stress test it, make sure there's a high degree of reliability, and then go sell it to these security teams. But as we were thinking through that process, and we were talking to this vendor segment as well, we realized, hey, actually the technical architecture here is pretty similar and can serve the needs of both segments. So why not start by selling into the vendor segment? Because there's a very clear need on their end. They use unified APIs and integration platforms for other types of integrations that they need to build in the CRM space or ticketing or HR or whatever it may be. So they get the concept. They have a need for security integrations. And we can generate revenue, right? We can start to build a sustainable business from the early days while building a common platform that can also serve security teams. So we don't see it as an either or equation. We see it as both. Our goal is to build a security data fabric, and the integration platform that is serving our vendor customers today is just one expression of that fabric, is the way we think about it. There can be many other expressions, many other use cases, but those will primarily be focused on the enterprise security teams. And we're just getting started with that motion.
Thinking about the vendor piece of it for now, then, I would imagine that for a more established security vendor, they already have integrations that are in place for the large majority of kind of popular tools that they would need to be integrated with, because that's a very early customer request, is to make sure that they're able to connect with all the different tools within the organization. So if I'm thinking about this right, I might not be, incorporating Lean would actually require rewriting some of those API connections and those integrations that they've already put in place. Maybe it's minor, just kind of switching out some methods and some requests, but ultimately it's adding rework and then only helping you with the kind of remaining new integrations that exist, which are probably lighter lifts at this point because you already have the kind of infrastructure in place within your organization in terms of how you go ahead and write these. So where I'm going with this is, have you found that Lean caters much more towards a kind of newer cybersecurity vendor that needs to kind of start from scratch in building out all these integrations? Or is there something that I'm missing in terms of the value that it provides to more established vendors that's where the value kind of outweighs the maybe slight refactoring costs?
So this is something we've been very cognizant about as we've built the platform. We work with companies all across the maturity curve, right? So there's very, very early companies where from day zero, essentially, they heard about us. They don't want to deal with integrations, right? Because they have a lot of other things to build. So they're just going to rely on Lean to provide those integrations. That's easy, makes a lot of sense intuitively. But we also have customers who are higher up on the maturity curve, like the scenario that you described, where they already have some security integrations. We have designed our platform to not be a rip and replace solution. So it's not so much about them having to refactor and rewrite their existing integrations. They can keep those. If they've built them natively, keep them. Any additional integrations that they need, they can work with Lean on that. And another sort of trigger point that we've organically discovered for them wanting to work with us or potentially migrate an existing integration over to us is if there's a breaking change that the upstream vendor makes and they just don't want to deal with the maintenance of it. And Lean already has the updated version. It's just easy enough for them to switch over and then migrate their customers to the Lean-powered version of the same integration.
Okay. So it sounds like it's more, to your point, you're able to just kind of include Lean for future integrations as opposed to requiring a complete unification of all the existing APIs already in place. Makes a ton of sense. Let's talk a little bit more then about the other kind of enterprise use case. Thinking about the core value of Lean is very much when you have to write a custom integration. Now, what we just talked about is how these different vendors have basically an obligation to their customers to write as many integrations as they possibly can. Ultimately, the burden largely falls on the vendor today. So when thinking about a company and their security organization that has all these tools from the vendors in place, is Lean providing the most value when you're just kind of creating a custom in-house tool that's trying to pull these different data sources? Because otherwise, if you're thinking about connecting like a vulnerability management platform and application security tool, both of which are already in place with the organization, they should already have a connection that's provided by each of those vendors.
Yeah, so there's two types of scenarios that we've discovered as we've been going through this process with security teams. The phase we're in right now is, so it's visibility is one, right? Today, the way a lot of the security data works is it's scoped one-to-one to the upstream tool that creates the data or detects whatever findings that tool is creating. You have to go into that dashboard to either view the data, or maybe you interact with the APIs directly, or you export CSVs. And we've heard that this is something that happens regularly for teams that are operating at scale. Now multiply that problem by 50 tools, right? How do you do reporting on that? How do you implement a security by numbers program so you actually have a good bird's eye view as well as an operational view of what's happening in your environment, what investments you're making, and how those are paying off? If you think about how data teams, and this generally most teams within especially tech-forward organizations operate, they're very numbers-driven now, right? You think about product teams and marketing teams, and everything is a funnel, everything is an experiment, everything is measured. And sure, there is measurement that happens on the security side, but I think when you try to get a bird's eye view of everything that's happening in your environment, it's actually very difficult because a lot of that data is scoped to these specific platforms, like I was explaining, and often there's a lot of overlap between the data as well. And to tie that together is actually quite a painful process. You need data engineering expertise, and security engineers are not data engineers, they're forced to be. So this is one of the gaps that we see from a visibility standpoint. So as we talk to teams, this is a very initial use case that we can help them with, where we almost act as a headless BI solution, right? We have these connectors that we built already. We do some correlation of data across different vendors. We clean up that data for them and we deliver it in a very clean pipeline, and they can view it anywhere they want. Maybe you want to view it in a BI tool like a Tableau or Power BI or a Looker, you can do that. You want us to build a custom web application where you want to view it, you can do that too. You want us to drop it into a Snowflake, we can do things like that. And then on the other side, to your point earlier, yes, there are companies that are much more tech forward and engineering forward. And this is actually a big part of our thesis as a company, is that the composition of security teams is trending way more technical. And that trend will only continue to accelerate because it kind of has to, right? Talking about distilling industries into their core problems, security is a big data problem. And to scale big data problems, you need to apply engineering principles to them. And we see that trend accelerating. A lot of the CISOs we talk to tell us of the open roles they have on their team, a very, very high percentage of them are for people with software engineering development skills. And there is no middleware layer that exists for these security engineers to interact with, to orchestrate the dozens of tools that they already have in their environment, to make the data accessible in code, to write some logic on top of that, define risk, right? The way every organization defines risk is very different. For, let's say, like a fintech company, they could be small, but in a very heavily regulated industry versus a regular B2B MarTech startup, right? Same size, but very different ways that they measure and define risk. And a lot of this can be done in code. Then you can write automations on top of that data that your tools are already producing. And we want to make that all accessible in code, because that's the way that this new crop of folks that are entering the security industry want to interact with their tools. They don't want all of their tools to be on Rails, which is how the reality of the industry is. That's how most tools have been developed today. They want more flexibility. And that's where we see something like Lean potentially helping teams like this.
It's interesting to hear you use the word thesis as part of your kind of rationale in terms of thinking about the space. And I don't think you're incorrect at all. I think also if you just think about AI making technology more accessible and writing code more accessible, then that certainly lends itself towards the trend that you're describing as well. So interesting breakdown in terms of some of these different ways that Lean can be used in an organization, and certainly lends itself towards organizations are looking for a bit more customization or more insights from their security stack. But again, not just for connecting like a vulnerability management platform and like a SAST scanning tool, but that's not a part of the kind of broader visibility challenge that you talked about. So one of the specific pieces I'm really curious about here, I mentioned in my example of ServiceNow and those different requests for integrations, how access was one of the key challenges. How is access actually managed within Lean? Because I could see this being potentially tricky. I assume that kind of each tool still has an underlying access token or credential that they have to go ahead and provide in order to make that connection. So then in some ways, you still have some of that organizational bureaucracy, but then it's just easier for the developers. How have you thought about that piece?
Yeah, so it varies depending on the segment that you're talking about. With the security teams, it's easier because in that case, it's B2B, right? We're the broker of the data and we handle the authentication. So we provide a lightweight interface where they enter their credentials to connect their Tenable or their CrowdStrike or their Sneak or whatever. And based on those credentials, we are able to start pulling on the data, and the destination, of course, is up to them. Like I was describing earlier, we can push that data whatever they want in a specific format. With the vendors, it's a B2B2B type of interaction, right? So we work with the vendor and the vendor has customers. So we're essentially collecting that end customer's credentials and then brokering the data and pushing it. In that case, we're pushing that data into the vendor's database, or sometimes they're calling us our APIs directly from within their application. So yeah, that's typically how we handle it. It's pretty straightforward. We have, we can support token-based authentication. We do OAuth-based authentication. It's fairly transparent to the end customer that there is a third party involved in this process, either in terms of the actual form that's collecting their credentials, where the vendor can choose to expose that it's Lean working under the hood, but definitely in their DPA and things like that, they reveal that Lean is the broker of the data.
So from a risk standpoint, is there a scenario where like an attacker could gain access to security team credentials to Lean and then be able to basically query security information from every security tool within that organization?
Yes, in theory, that's possible. But of course, we take every precaution we possibly can to store the credentials very safely, and everything is architected in a way where we have a microservices-based architecture, and the onboarding service that actually has access to the credentials is different than the service that actually pulls the data. And we've done a lot of those things. We've gone through our SOC 2 compliance and whatnot to make sure. We know, of course, the responsibility we're taking on with the type of data, this very sensitive type of data that we're storing on our side. That being said, we also have the flexibility to work on different deployment models. So what I've described, of course, the classic SaaS deployment where we host the data and we serve it over our API to our customers on whatever cadence they want to pull it. But we are actively exploring ways where we could store and process that data all within customers' cloud as well. There are, of course, customers that are more sensitive to the governance, the processing of that data. So this is something we're exploring at the moment.
Yeah, makes sense. And there's always the argument of, okay, if someone already has access to that information, are you already hosed in some other way as well, right? Like if you have access to developer credentials within the organization, is Lean really the point of failure? But it just occurred to me as a potentially kind of interesting ramification of this approach. So again, certain that you're taking all the necessary precautions, but had to ask regardless. Now, we've talked a lot about the kind of business strategy piece in terms of understanding these two different segments of the market, vendors versus security organizations. We've talked about some of the different capabilities in terms of kind of aggregating information from a certain class of security tools. So EDR versus AppSec versus CSPM. Both of those elements, I imagine, are giving you a lot of roadmap work to get through in terms of making some of these determinations and continuing to build out the platform. But I'm curious to hear from you directly. What is really top of mind as you think about taking Leen to the next step on the kind of technical product roadmap standpoint?
Yeah, we want to serve both of these segments and we want to do it simultaneously. I know the classic startup advice is do one thing and do it really well. I sort of disagree with that, right? The nice thing with what we're building, like I said earlier, is that there's a common technical platform that can serve two different personas. Of course, there are some nuances and we need to change a few things, but we want to grow this company in that way and serve these two different markets very early on. And eventually, the value in what we're building is in integrating with everything under the sun in security, right? Today, we primarily work with integrations on the cloud side of these products. So let's take Tenable as an example. So we're integrated with the cloud version of Tenable. But we know as we go to these more sophisticated security organizations, they still have on-prem deployment, so they still have a Nessus deployment of Tenable. So that's a big thing that we're going to be focused on soon, is figuring out how to extract the on-prem data in the same way that we can extract cloud data. And then just going into a whole bunch of other categories, some of which I mentioned earlier, your email security, MDM, firewalls, BIMs, ITSM platforms. So really, there should be no barriers. Our vision is for there to be no barriers for any of the data, right? It's no longer siloed. It's accessible no matter where it lives, on-prem, cloud, whatever vendor. And then on the other side, that's only on the read side of the equation. On the write side of the equation, you can also automate and take actions within all of those tools, all using code, right? You no longer have to rely on sort of clunky GUIs and go to 5 different dashboards to, blacklist an IP or disable a user or whatever. Maybe it could be a single API call and we'll unify that action across every instance where that particular user, for example, exists. So that's really what we're focused on, is on-prem support, different cloud, different deployment models, read and write actions across all of these different vendors.
Yeah, it's kind of ironic that for a company that's focused on eliminating the headache of integrations, so much of your roadmap and the work ahead of you is building out a bunch of integrations with all these different tool suites. So I think all the more kudos to you for kind of taking on that problem yourself so others don't have to, in a way. But
that's exactly how we think about it. If we do this right, we execute correctly, no one should have to do this, right? No one should have to do this repeat work that happens across all of these organizations, which, if you think about it, is a huge waste of resources in the grand scheme of things.
Well, Kabir, really appreciate the time. Thank you for just kind of sharing the backstory here and everything that you guys have put together. Last question for you. Are you currently looking for funding or hiring?
We're not looking for funding. We raised a round last year. We luckily have been capital efficient and have plenty of money in the bank to execute some of the things that I've been talking about. We're always hiring. Even if we're not actively hiring, we're always passively hiring. We're a small team of 8, and we're always looking for talented engineers, folks with security backgrounds. We will potentially hire someone on the product side soon to spearhead a lot of the things I was talking about on the enterprise side. So if any of your listeners fit those descriptions, they should feel free to reach out, and maybe there's an opportunity to work together.
Perfect. Thank you so much for the time.
Thanks, Kyle. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and you can write to me at kyle@secureventures.io. I'm Kyle McNulty, and you've been listening to Secure Ventures.